All right, welcome back to Introduction to Ethics. In today's lecture, the topic is going to be utilitarianism. And utilitarianism is what's sometimes called a consequence-based ethic. If you remember in the last video, we talked about deontology, and I told you that deontology and utilitarianism are opposites. In deontology, you don't consider the consequences of actions. You consider the goodwill. You want to know if the person's doing the right thing for the right reasons. In utilitarianism, the question is going to be, what are the consequences of my action? And the consequences are what determine whether or not something is right or wrong. So within this consequentialist type moral theory, they are going to be looking at what is a result of a person's actions. And for utilitarianism in particular, the most basic principle for utilitarianism is the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. And so if you're bringing a greater amount of good to a greater number of people, then whatever it is that you're doing is considered to be moral within this particular moral theory. And so all of your actions should be weighed according to the question, am I bringing a greater amount of good to a greater number of people, or am I bringing a greater amount of harm to a greater number of people? And so especially with utilitarianism, and we'll see as we're getting into it, the people who are creating this, they want to take a scientific approach where you're trying to use a concept of weight. And so think of a scale where you put on the scale good consequences for the greater amount of consequences for the greater number of people, good consequences for a greater number of people, versus the consequences for a lesser number of people, and whichever side weighs the most, then that's how you determine if something is morally right or wrong. So kind of keep that scale mentality in your mind, and think about quality and quantity of the experiences that the individual is having, and we have to weigh all those things out. And it is, like I say, they really are trying to take that scientific approach. I guess oddly for moral theories, utilitarianism was actually taken out of the realm of just theory and was put into practice as well. So we've actually seen a society where the people tried to take this and make it the theory where that the society was based on and ran on. So it's a very interesting and a very useful theory, and like all theories, it's got those good points and it's going to have its weaknesses, as we'll see as we get into it. Okay, so utilitarianism has its foundation, has its roots in a fellow by the name of Jeremy Bentham. And Bentham is the originator, but he's not the one who makes it the most famous. That's going to be John Stuart Mill. And so most of the time we talk about John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, but Bentham is the one who really kind of put all the pieces together and created it. It's not that other people didn't have similar ideas before him, it's just that he's the one who kind of founds it. And Bentham, as it turns out, is going to be highly influential on Mill. And so we see Mill then taking what Bentham created and making it better, really, because what Bentham did is that he only thought about quantity, and so the quantity of an experience, and he didn't really consider the quality of an experience. And John Stuart Mill is going to be somebody who's going to bring in that quality as well. In fact, Bentham, as he's creating utilitarianism, some of his critics began calling Bentham's utilitarianism a pig's morality, because the idea here is that the idea behind that pig's morality is that it's always more. It's quantity of good experiences. And so, like a pig, without considering the quality of the slop that they're eating, like pigs don't consider that, they just eat it, that was kind of the mentality, that was the thinking, that was the criticism of Bentham. And so Mill is going to make some adjustments there, and some good adjustments as well, some very important ones. Now, before we get into utilitarianism fully, let's take a quick look at John Stuart Mill, because some of his background is going to be important for understanding utilitarianism and what it is that Mill is trying to do. All right, so this is Mill. His system of logic stands as something as a Bible for experimental science, and his defense of utilitarianism remains perhaps the clearest of his writings. In all, he has placed his mark on science, politics, ethics, and philosophy. And so he is going to be a thinker whose ideas aren't simply limited to the realm of ethics and to utilitarianism. He's going to be someone who is highly influential, especially in his time in the political world as well. He is going to marry a woman and be heavily involved in the women's suffrage movement as well. His life is from 1806 to 1873. He was homeschooled by his father, and his father was someone who was highly intellectually motivated and very, very, very powerful. He had a strong mind himself. And so his father's name was James Mill. And so we have John Stuart Mill, and I'll try to call him John Stuart Mill, especially when I'm flip-flopping back and forth between him and his father. But James Mill is the father of John Stuart Mill. And Jeremy Bentham was a tutor of John Stuart Mill as well. And so he is going to be highly influential on the Mill family here. The father, James, put his son through both the Greek and the Latin classics at a very, very early age. Around the age of 8 or 10, John Stuart Mill could already read the Greek and Latin classics in both Greek and Latin. He was also put through the philosophies of Adam Smith and the economic philosophies of Adam Smith and David Ricardo. He studied world history, studied logic, and he studied mathematics as well, all as a very, very young child. And so here we have a child who is actually quite brilliant, and his father homeschools him and makes sure that he continues to educate the boy and like feeding his intellectual powers as much as he possibly could. In fact, what we see here is that James, the father, kept John Stuart Mill, kept the son away from other boys. He kept them kind of isolated away from them so that he would cultivate his mind rather than being affected by other little boys often being rather crass and crude in their thinking and in their humor and in the way they play. And so he kept him away from all of those things as well. What we see here as well is that the family was quite poor in their beginnings. And so John Stuart Mill's parents didn't have a lot of money, but thanks to the patronage of the Stuart family, and that's where we get the name John Stuart Mill, they named it after this family, that Stuart family supported James and put him through an education, got him an education at Edinburgh. And Edinburgh is the place to go at this point to get the best education in the world. Edinburgh was called the Scotland of the North. I'm sorry, it's in Scotland. It's the capital. It's in Scotland. It was called the Athens of the North, not the Scotland of the North. The Athens of the North, because it really was the center of learning at this particular time. And so the father received a tremendous education there at Edinburgh, and he studied to be a clergyman, but he became really rather cynical and walked away from especially organized religion. One of my favorite quotes is that he walked away from any god who would create a hell. The idea here just being that he was looking to pursue this one job, this one line of work, and then he instead became an employee of the East India Trading Company. And so the East India Trading Company, if you're familiar with the Pirates of the Caribbean series, that's one point those were kind of some of the bad guys in that particular that particular series. And the East India Trading Company really was a real thing. It was a very powerful trade company with offices all around the world. And so he was an employee of that company. And while he was working for them, he created a tremendous work on the history of India, and through creating that particular work, he set his family up financially for life. And so, if you're thinking about the time frame that we're looking at here in the 1800s, books are something that not everyone has. I don't know how many hundred books in my house, and I'm sure you've got many, many books as well, but that wasn't the case in the 1800s. Having books wasn't something that most people necessarily had. It was a sign of wealth, and it was almost like a luxury. And so if somebody had 100 books, they were very, very wealthy, and they had a very, very amazing collection of books, because that was just a lot. And so when James, the father, creates this book, and it is authoritative, it's a great work, then he sets his family up financially, because again, books are something of a rarity at that time. So that's how they came into money, and continued to have money throughout the life of Mill here. All right, there's another writer, a French writer by the name of Auguste Comte, right? And so Auguste Comte, Auguste, 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 and then the last name is pronounced Comte, and it's Comte, Auguste Comte, Comte. Auguste Comte is a French writer who is going to have a tremendous effect on Mill's thinking and on Mill's writing. He is someone who had a considerable effect on the world at the time, especially after his writings. But his writings are going to influence the world tremendously, and here they're going to influence Mill. And so we're going to take a look kind of quickly at some pieces of what he's going to do as well. And so here we have with Mill and with utilitarianism, especially with utilitarianism, a quote from Mill: "Actions are right as they tend to let's try that again. Actions are right as they tend to produce happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness." And so the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, or sometimes it's put this way as well, and I'll use both, the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. So in this case, actions are right as they tend to produce happiness, and they're wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Don't misunderstand what Mill is saying here. He is not an Epicurean, and if you remember the Epicureans, they're basing everything simply on pleasure, and so it's more complex than that. It's going in a different direction than just pleasure. So it's not an Epicurean position on just go out and seek pleasure, and then you've got morality, you've got things that are right and wrong. He's not an Epicurean. He says that Epicureanism is something that would degrade, and that type of pleasure seeking is low and it's vulgar. And so remember that I said that Mill, his father, tried to keep him separated from other little boys, because other boys' thinking they're crass and they're crude. And so he kept Mill separated from all those other boys. And then Mill, as he's developing a moral theory, he's not saying that morality is really just about going out and searching for those things that make you happy, that bring you pleasure, like going out to the bar or going to one of the Greek orgies or something like that, Mill is going to say that there's much, much more to it, that you have to have a pleasure that lifts you up, something that is uplifting, and that it's not just that it causes you pleasure, but that it's also got a high degree of quality. So going out and getting drunk and being crass there in the local tavern is not something that's uplifting and wholesome. It's crass and crude. So he's not talking about that kind of pleasure. He's talking about a pleasure that builds you up and does in fact improve you as a human being. So, right. But as he says this does throw open the door of possibility for all philosophies of life. Mill says this is the way it should be. All things should be considered fully, and each man should, in the end, be allowed to live their lives in any such way as they choose. So you can become anything that it is that you want to become. One condition being that you cannot be allowed to impose on the freedom of another. So you should be allowed basically to live your life any way you choose. Very libertarian type position here. Live your life any way you choose, as long as you're not imposing on the freedom of other people. So you can do anything you want as long as you're not taking away from someone else's freedom to do anything that they want. Utilitarianism, as I said before, has been put into real-world application, unlike some other plans for ethics. Bentham, the original creator, is considered the founder of the movement, and again, here, pleasure and pain were the twin standards for determining rightness and wrongness. And so it's the greatest amount of pleasure or the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of persons, or trying to bring bringing the greatest amount of pleasure to the greatest number of persons. Bentham discovered what other hedonists, though, had discovered, that is the hedonistic calculus. And remember, I said they're trying to make this very, very scientific. And so they've got a type of calculus, or a calculator, a way of calculating the amount of pleasure, the amount of good that's being done versus the amount of harm that's being done. With it, you measure the degree and preferability of one pleasure over another. And so Bentham, as he's looking at these pleasures, he is always going to give more weight. Remember, I said the scales, right? He's going to give more weight to quantity than he is to quality. And so Bentham would have said, this is my example, not Bentham's, Bentham, yeah, you'll see why. Bentham would say that an hour of tic-tac-toe is better than 15 minutes of Xbox. Why? Because you get to spend more time playing the game. So he's not going to think about the quality of the experience, tic-tac-toe not being as good a quality experience as playing Xbox. Obviously, Bentham did not have an Xbox. But, I'm trying to get an example here that we can certainly relate to. Or, Bentham would say that it's better to have a gallon of a cheaper wine than it is to have, say, a quart of a more expensive and therefore, in this case, better tasting wine. Why? Because there's more of it. And so it's that quality, it's the quantity that matters for Bentham. But Mill is going to come along and he's going to say, no, quality is also important. And so he's going to add to the hedonist calculator the idea of quality. Now, with that hedonist calculator and with the scale, we're after pleasure, we're after happiness, we're after the best of experiences. What we're getting here is what's called the greatest happiness principle. And so yet another way to express this idea of utilitarianism, or the greatest happiness principles, it is put as the greatest good for the greatest number. All of these things applying towards utilitarianism. And so the greatest good for the greatest number in this case. Consequences, then, are the most important aspect for morality. As you behave, what you have to do is consider the consequences of the actions that you're about to take, and if they're going to give a greater number of persons a good experience, then that's what you ought to do. That's the moral thing to do. Again, the opposite of deontology, where we don't consider consequences at all. So, with this scientific idea of measuring and trying to put it onto a scale, what we've got is we're trying to merge some kind of math and ethics. We're trying to put these things together because we're weighing amounts. And so in order for there to be a way of measuring, then you have to have units of measurement. And what Mill came up with was the positive, the things that are good, that are going to land on the good side of the scale, are called hedons, and in the negative side, those are called dolors. Now, hedons is spelled Hedons, and dollars is spelled Dollors, and you can just hear hedonism, that idea of pleasure, right, of hedonism. That's the positive, and then dollars is Latin, and it translates as pain. So Dollors, Latin for pain. And so you've got the good, you've got the pleasurable, and then you've got the dollars, which is going to be the pain on the other side. So trying to bring that greatest amount of good versus the greatest amount of evil. And so what you do as you're looking at, say, any type of problem, you're trying to figure out what's the moral thing to do, what's the right way to behave, what should this group of individuals do in this circumstance. Well, you take the hedons and the dollars and you try to put them onto that scale to figure out which way it tips. And if it tips towards the good, you do this, and if it tips toward the bad, then you don't do this. And so, for example, and this is kind of a broader, kind of a social example, as opposed to a strictly moral one, although there are moral aspects to this issue, to this example, but it really just is more of a trying to get you to see how the scale system will work. All right, so imagine for a moment that we're trying to figure out what to do with a school lunch program. Here we have individuals who are saying that we should, go in this direction with the program, go in this direction with the program. What do? We take all of the information, we lay it out, we figure out how much it weighs, and we put it on the scales, right? So first of all, the positive sides, the benefits of of trying to improve the school lunch program. One of the benefits would be increased nutrition for X number of children, how many ever children are being fed by this program. So there's going to be better nutrition. Now, if you've got better nutrition with children, obviously you're going to have better children, physically, mentally, all of those things. So better nutrition for how many ever children there are within the program. That's going to mean increased performance within those children. So here's a second thing that's good. An increased performance within those children, and that is going to result in a greater long-range chance of success. And so if they're physically healthy and they're mentally healthy, what we're doing is we're investing in our children, and they are going to have a better chance at a better future, and obviously then so are others around them. And so all of these good things are piling up here on one side of the scale towards we need to invest more in our school lunch program, whether that better quality, better quantity of food, all these different things. And then there's also going to be some incidental benefits to individuals within the community, individuals like contractors. And what they mean there is that with the other members of the society are also going to benefit if we're trying to bring in more or better food. Say the farmers in the area might benefit because we're using some of their production, the things that they're producing. It would also perhaps include, say, more cooks or something like that. So there's going to be more jobs. So there's going to be kind of incidental stuff, not just the direct good that's going to happen to the children. There's going to be some impact on the community there as well in a positive way. All right, so that's some of the beneficial aspects of improving the school lunch program. Here are some of the bad side, right? First of all, it's going to cost more for the taxpayers. If we start including more food and better food, that quality of food and the quantity of food is going to cost more, and so individuals in the community are going to have to pay more taxes in order to improve this school lunch program. So there is the cost to the taxpayers in that surrounding area as well. Also, contrasting that with other programs that could have been funded with lower tax, with lower taxes or no programs as well. And what that means is that there are going to be other programs that if we take money, if we take the money out of those programs and begin investing it into, say, the nutrition, into the school lunch program, then say the arts programs, seems like the music programs are always one of the first ones to go. And so what's going to happen then is that we might take money away from them. And so you could steal from the artistic, from the arts side of things in order to support the school lunch program. And that part of education is important as well. And so you're going to have other programs within the school that might suffer if we increase the cost of school lunch programs. Now, what you have to do is take those positives, take the negatives, and then multiply them by the number of individuals who are affected and also by the intensity of the effects. And so let's just say that there's 1,000 kids in the school lunch program. In order to increase the quality and quantity of food, let's say there's 100,000 people in the community. I don't know, I'm just trying to keep them round. Let's say there's 100,000 people in the community. And we're going to have to increase these people's taxes in order to pay for this school lunch program. Everyone's taxes are going to go up. And it doesn't matter if they have kids in the programs or if they don't have kids at all. Everyone is going to have to pay more taxes in order to increase the quality and quantity. And so all of these individuals are going to be affected by the increase in the tax. Well, what if the tax increase is only, half a cent a year? Well, that's not much of a tax. Probably people can spare, very, very small increase in taxes like that. But what if the tax increase is more like $100 a month? And that's kind of a ridiculous number, but you can see what we mean by the intensity of the effects. If your taxes go up that much, that's really going to impact people and their families a lot more drastically. So you have to take all of these factors and put them together. Now, what if everyone in the community, and this would be an odd community as well, but what if everyone in the community has a child in that program? Well, that's a positive thing. And if they're all on board with this idea of nutrition and trying to increase the quality and quantity of the food, then some of those negatives start to kind of go away, because that would be what these individuals want, and everybody's got a child in the program anyway, and so so you kind of have to take in all of these different aspects, all of the bits of information, put them on the scale, see which side weighs more than the other. Is it tipping towards, yes, this is good and therefore we ought to do it, or is it tipping toward, the answer is no and we ought not do it? And so that's the thinking behind utilitarianism, the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, right? And so, as I said, not necessarily a moral issue here, just trying to get you an example so you can start thinking about how utilitarianism would work as far as numbers and scientific measuring goes. Okay. All right. When it comes to utilitarianism, and school lunch programs, it seems that there are many things that are measurable and they're countable. But when it comes to some aspects, especially moral aspects, it's difficult to see how you can quantify certain experiences within human existence. Pleasure and preference, satisfaction, are easier to quantify than, say, happiness or ideals. And so my ideal education system, for example, might look like one thing, and someone else's ideal education system might look like something else. So how do you decide what counts and when it counts? That's going to be one of the things that utilitarianism is going to be facing. Can we, in fact, count everything, or are there some things that can't be necessarily counted and put onto the scales in order to be weighed? Can everything be quantified? Some people maintain that some of the most important things in life, like love or family, like the value of family, can't be easily quantified. And so how is it that you decide how much love weighs on the scale, or how much family, the importance of the value of family, weighs on that scale? And it's going to be different for each individual, and within each family it's going to be different. And so how is it exactly that you quantify that you count it? Those things cannot be easily quantified, they can't be easily counted, while other things like productivity or material goods can be emphasized more precisely because you can count them. And so you can look at, within that school lunch program, you can look at and count the vegetables that each child would then have access to. And so what happens in utilitarianism is sometimes we tend to overweight things that are countable, things that you can count, as opposed to things that you can't, simply because you can't put a weight, you can't put a number on some things, and so we tend to overcount the things that we can count. So that's one issue that here within this system, within this scaling system, right, that utilitarianism is going to face. Another thing that you're going to face with this trying to weigh out things within the system, another issue that you're going to run into is, are all experiences necessarily commensurable? Do they necessarily all count in the same way? So for example, is a good dinner of the same value as a good night's sleep? Can you substitute them for each other? Do they weigh the same? And so can you just swap them out, so to speak, or do they balance each other out, or is there something, or one of those more important than the other? And the answer is probably very, very situational in that case. Probably depends on if you need the food more or if you need the sleep more. And so how is it that you try to measure these two things up? And it's a difficult thing to see that if utilitarianism can do it, or if utilitarianism can't do it. It's a difficult thing to imagine, or to come to some way of figuring out if that's possible. Okay. Within utilitarianism, there are two types of utilitarianism. There's what's called act utilitarianism, and there's what's called rule utilitarianism, R-U-L-E, rule. And so act utilitarianism looks at the consequences of each individual acts, and it calculates the utility each time the act is performed. So within act utilitarianism, you have to weigh every single action before you do it to see if it is moral, and that's why it's act utilitarianism. You weigh out every single act. Well, that's going to be quite burdensome over a long period of time, isn't it? That's going to be a difficult thing to do because you have to consider every single action. And so some utilitarianists came up and said, you know what, we need just kind of basic rules that are going to let us not have to consider every single action every time before we do it. And so they said, we'll make some general rules. And so that's when you've got rule utilitarianism. And so rule utilitarianism looks at the consequences of having everyone follow a particular rule, and calculates the overall utility of accepting or rejecting the rule. And so you look at this and you say, well, what's going to bring the greatest amount of good or the greatest amount of pleasure to the greatest number of people? And if it's this type of action, then that's the action you do. As a general rule, you follow the idea that don't kill, don't murder, don't steal, don't lie, don't, all of these things. So you follow general basic rules. You don't have to sit down then and figure out if you should murder this person over here, the general rule says, no, don't do that. And so you follow rules, and that way you don't have to consider whether or not you should take your car and ram it into another person's car who cut you off in traffic. General good rule, don't, purposefully slam your car into another person's car. There might be a time to do it, but as a general rule, don't do this. So the problem with rule utilitarianism is that it really winds up looking less like a consequentialist type of ethic, because you're not considering the consequences, and instead you're following a basic rule, which looks a lot like deontology, doesn't it? And so Kant had those rules: don't steal, don't lie, those universals, those categorical imperatives. And that's what you kind of wind up looking like if you behave like a rule utilitarianist. Besides, as a rule utilitarianist, you are still a utilitarianist, right? You can then look at this and say, I'm weighing all of the actions, and yes, this is the general rule, but here's the exception. So you're not really a rule utilitarianist, you're an act utilitarianist. But even if as an act utilitarianist, you are still going to have to either spend all of your time trying to figure out precisely what you should do in every situation, or you're going to have to accept kind of general rules. Don't ram your car into other cars on purpose. Well, then you're a rule utilitarianist, not an act utilitarianist, but as a rule and around and around and around in a circle it goes. And so what you kind of get is this difficulty, this constant struggle, this kind of push and pull between act and rule utilitarianist, and it's not necessarily clear which one is necessarily better within the utilitarianist idea. And so imagine like using the act versus the rule utilitarianist mentality. Which way would you go here on this example that I'm about to give you? And this one is more of a moral example. So thinking in utilitarianistic terms, what should you do? And thinking then also as an act utilitarianist or as a rule utilitarianist, utilitarianist and not utilitarianist, act and rule utilitarianism. Think about how you should behave according to those principles as well. So here's the scenario, here's the moral scenario. Take a listen, see what you think. Imagine the following scenario. A prominent and much loved leader has been rushed to the hospital, grievously wounded by an assassin's bullet. He needs a heart and lung transplant immediately to survive. No suitable donors are available, but there is a homeless person in the emergency room who is being kept alive on a respirator, who probably has only a few days to live, and who is a perfect donor. Without the transplant, the leader will die. The homeless person will die in a few days anyway. Security at the hospital is very well controlled. The transplant team could hasten the death of the homeless person and carry out the transplant without the public ever knowing that they killed the homeless person for his organs. What should they do? Here you've got this leader, a great leader. All you have to do is take a homeless person who's about to die anyway, kind of give him a little push along, help him die a little faster, and the leader can continue to live. Do you give that homeless person a little bit of a push? They're not a productive member of society. And in this case, in this scenario, they haven't any family. They're not going to be missed. The leader did not abuse himself. It's not like he went out and was an alcoholic and drank himself to death or anything like that. It was an assassin's bullet. You can bring a great amount of good to a great number of people simply by helping the homeless person along. You kind of give them a push. They're going to die anyway, so what do you do? As a utilitarianist, you might look at the scenario and say, yes, we're going to bring a greater amount of good, a greater amount of pleasure to a greater number of people by saving the leader, and so we should in fact give the homeless person a push and save the leader. All kinds of moral dilemmas then come into question in that case, because what you're doing or what you're having to do is to look at the value of human life and try to figure out if there are ever any circumstances under which you can say, this individual's life is more valuable than this individual's life. And while often I think that we do make those kinds of judgments, here what we're doing is we're making the judgment in a way of determining life and death. We're not just saying this person's life was of greater value, they accomplished more in their life. We're saying this person's life is more valuable, and therefore we can end this person's life in order to save this person's life. And so we're using a different kind of meaning there when we say a value system on human life. What should happen in that situation? The homeless person is going to die in a few days. Should this group of individuals continue to look at the homeless person and say it doesn't matter if they're going to die in a few days, they're still human, their life is still valuable, and it's at least even valuable to them, and therefore they deserve to live out their life. They deserve to live out their life as long as they can, even if it's just that life there in the hospital. Many of my students will argue that the homeless person's life is of a very low quality. As they are there in the hospital, it's not like you're going out and pulling them out from under the bridge where they live and then, taking their life that way. It's of low quality as they're there in the hospital anyway, and so perhaps then it's okay to take that person's life early so that this individual can live, which again then begins to ask the question, well, if we take that step off the slope, if we begin to say, well, if we do that, if we go in that direction and we start saying, well, it's okay to end this life, where does it end? And that's that slippery slope scenario. The question is, once you step off of solid ground onto the slippery slope, how far down the slippery slope will you slide? Will you, in the end, become something like some of the Hollywood tales, some of the movies, where we begin growing clones of ourselves and then saying it's okay to harvest the organs of those clones? Much like in this case, we'd be harvesting the organs of the homeless person. Is that moral? Is that a moral thing for us to be able to do? How far is it then okay to go? Is it okay to walk into the hospital room of an older person and say, well, yeah, they've only got a week to live. We could harvest their organs and put them in this other person's body and they could live for another 10 years. Are we going to begin going down that road becomes part of the moral question. So as you're thinking about this and as you're trying to weigh all of the good and the bad consequences, the qualities, the quantities of experiences that the different individuals are going to have, mentally try putting them on that scale to see which side it tips for you. Do you land on the side of, yes, we should go ahead and give the homeless person a push and save the leader, or do we say, no, that human life is in fact valuable, and therefore we have to let it play out according to whatever path it takes? And so then the leader's going to die and the homeless person's going to die, and well, that's that. Put them on the scale, see which side it is that you think you will end up on. All right. So usually when I give an example like that in class, there's a very long discussion, and at the end I take a vote just to kind of see where people fall, and it's hard to do that kind of thing here in the virtual world, so you'll just have to do it on your own as best you can. And then certainly contact me if you have questions or thoughts or anything like that as well. Okay. All right, now turning to the weaknesses of utilitarianism. We've been doing a little bit of discussion on them, and I wanted to get into these into the weaknesses with some time left, because some of them are going to take us a bit of time in order to fully understand exactly what it is and the implications and how they're going to play themselves out for us today in the modern world as well. Okay, so there's going to be 6 weaknesses for utilitarianism, and here's the first one. The first weakness is the difficulties of reasoning about matters of life and death. What value would be put on human life, and when would we say it's acceptable from a utilitarian perspective to allow a life to end, or even end it and for some greater good? Not just allow it to end, but actually go ahead and take it. Just like we were talking about just now with the homeless person and the leader, when is it acceptable to not prolong that life? Let's say the homeless person, maybe it's not giving them a push, but rather it's simply allowing them to die so that they could retrieve the organs. Whereas it's possible to keep the homeless person alive for another month or two. Should that be the case? Should they then let the homeless person die as opposed to pushing them? Just simply say, well, we could save them for another month, but we need the organs for the leader, and so just let him go ahead and die, and sooner. The question really is, what is the value of that life? What's the value of the human life? And so it's not clear within the utilitarian system how you would put the value of human life on the scale. How much does that homeless person's value weigh, as opposed to how much does the good leader, how much does their life value weigh? Are they just perfectly equal, or does one weigh more or less? Is it enough to tip the scale in one direction or another? How do we know? How do we make that decision? Also, we already don't behave in ways that demonstrate that we really do value, often we already don't behave in ways that demonstrate that we really do value human life. We often take actions putting other people's lives in danger, and for some trivial reason. And if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I don't put other people's lives at risk for trivial reasons, then this is one of those moments, especially in my classroom, where there's kind of a discussion of you probably have and you probably do. I've done it. Pretty much anybody probably who drives is going to be guilty of this exact thing. We talk about the value of human life, well, like with the leader and the homeless person, and the overwhelming majority of my students are going to say, no, we have to let the leader die. We can't hasten the homeless person's death just to save the leader, because we value human life. And then we get to this PowerPoint slide and I start talking to them about, do you actually value human life? Do you truly value it? Or when you're late to work, do you drive erratically? Do you break the speed laws? Do you speed especially through school zones? Do you put other people's lives and other people's well-being at risk because you're late for work? Now, being late for work, it matters, it's important. Obviously, you want to be able to keep your job, but do you really want to take the risk of harming a child in a school zone by speeding through a school zone? Is it really morally acceptable for you because you're late again? And that's not the other driver's fault. So if you're late for work, it's not the fault of my teenage son, it's not the fault of my grandmother, it's not the fault of any of my family who also drives on these roads that you're late for work. And it might not be your fault either in this circumstance, but is it really acceptable morally for you then to put their lives in danger by driving in an unsafe manner? And if you're thinking to yourself, it's okay, I can handle the speed, or I can handle the way I'm driving, weaving in and out of traffic. Well, that may be true. I don't know you. I don't know your driving capabilities. But I do know that right now I'm teaching my teenage stepdaughter to drive. And you might be able to handle the speed. You might be comfortable cutting in and out of traffic. But you don't know what's happening in those other cars. And if you cause her to panic, and she then runs off the road or hits another car because she doesn't know that you can do what you're trying to do, then you have directly caused harm to another person, and it could be fatal. It could be more than just property damage, or it could be life and limb. Do you actually value human life? As you're looking at the homeless person in that scenario, perhaps it's easy to say, yes, I value human life. No, we can't do that. But do you actually live with that mentality, or perhaps do you make excuses for your own day-to-day activities where you say, well, it's okay, I can do this, I'm justified, or they're idiots, or whatever other excuse do you make? And driving in traffic is just the easy example there to give, because most people are doing it, and most of us misbehave at some point while we're driving, right? And so just trying to think through how much you actually really do value human life. Do you really demonstrate it through your actions day to day? Or do you perhaps only pay it lip service when you're sitting in something like a ethics class where, well, no, we value human life, right? Something to kind of ponder as you're moving on with your day as well. What are your driving habits? Do you truly value human life? Okay. All right, so the first weakness of utilitarianism was, what about those things like the value of human life? How do we weigh something like that in a utilitarian perspective? It's unclear that that's possible. The second one, what about the role of emotions in the utilitarian view of the moral life? Utilitarianism has no way of determining if good and bad emotions weigh the same. Emotions are taken into account and weighed. It's something that they want to think about. But do good emotions count for more as you're trying to weigh them? And how do we factor in the long-term effects of taking some action that creates bad emotions but will give rise to more good emotions later? So how do you measure the weight of those good versus bad emotions as you're moving through life? So for example, since you've made it to this point in the class, you have sat down and weighed the good and the bad effects of trying to complete this course. So for you, what you've done is you've sat down and you've said, I hate this course. It's really, really boring, and it's just, ridiculously hard, and I want nothing. There's nothing in the world I hate more than this course right now, but it's going to get me a college degree, right? Passing this course is part of getting a college degree, and the long-term effects of getting a college degree far outweigh the bad that I have to suffer through, this idiot who is talking to me right now. It's true that this is bad, and so I've got these bad emotions that are associated with this class, but it's for a short time, whereas the long-term effects later are going to be good. Now that's a pretty easy thing for you to figure out. Much better to suffer through this course and have that college degree than it is to quit. Your life is going to be better if you'll complete your college degree. So that's kind of an easier thing to weigh. But begin thinking about how do we, in fact, measure long-term effects on groups of people? Is that something we can really do in other scenarios where it's not quite so easy and it's not quite so obvious, right? That scenario with your college degree is pretty easy and it's pretty obvious. But when it comes to trying to figure out long-term effects of good and bad emotions, and how it's going to affect this number of people over a long term, that's not quite so easy to do. How quickly will the good emotions fade? How long will the bad emotions stay with the person? Those type of things aren't really that easy to calculate, and so it becomes another difficulty that utilitarianism is going to face. All right, that's number 2. Now number 3. What about the limits of personal responsibility? For utilitarians, if the outcome is good for the greater number, then the act is good. This will not account for the fact that the person acting may despise the actions required under this system. Utilitarianism does not take into account that persons also have personal responsibility attached to their actions, and these must be weighty when deciding on actions as well. And so it's really rather awful example, but let me put it to you this way and see if this kind of helps you understand. imagine that you're in a scenario where there are two trains, and you can save train A but not train B. Or train, you can save one of the two trains, you just can't save them both. And so you've got train A and you've got train B. On train A is your mother, just your mother, nobody else. She's a conductor apparently. And on train B, there's 100 people. The utilitarianist view would say that you have to save the train with 100 people because it's the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. It's going to be bringing more good to more people. But what about the fact that you'd have to let your own mother die? Well, that's not taken into account within utilitarianism. It's not really, it's not something that they focus on, and that they say, well, what about my own personal feelings towards the individual on that train, and the fact that I would have to be responsible for the death of my own mother? Albeit somewhat indirectly, I'm still responsible for the fact that I didn't save her. And utilitarianism simply does not take into account those types of scenarios. What if the individual, what they're having to do is horrifying to them? Or imagine another scenario where, say, an individual say, has to commit some type of crime, has to do something that's absolutely horrifying in their own eyes in order to bring the greatest amount of good to the greatest number of persons. Utilitarianism doesn't account for those kinds of difficulties that those people are going to face. And so the fact that this person is personally responsible isn't really taken into account because the greater good for the greater number outweighs the fact that this one individual is being forced to act in a way that they find despicable. Utilitarianism just has no way of dealing with that. All right, that was number 3. Here's number 4. What about the place of personal integrity in utilitarianist world? A utilitarian would not be able to distinguish between helping the many and helping the self, or even making the self happy, if it means others would suffer somehow because of their non-interaction. Also, it's unclear that future results are taken into account. Helping the many now may not have lasting good effects, while helping the self now might have good lasting effects, and would therefore be the right moral thing to do. Okay? So what we see here is the question of the long-lasting effects of an action, and how that should play out. So it's unclear how the future results should count. How should they be weighed? Or should I take care of the self now and invest in the self now so that my good experience can last for a longer amount of time? Or do I simply have to try to constantly do the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of persons? So, all right, try to give you an example to try to make this clear. Imagine that you've got, I don't know, let's say you've got $100,000, and you have the ability to take that money and invest it in your own future, which would make you happy and happier over a longer period of time, right? So that's a goodly sum of money. It's something that's going to help you and to have a good and longer and better life, right? So imagine that you've got that as one option. Option number 2 is that you could then, let's say, go out and spend that $100,000 and buy, how many people would that buy a $10 lunch for, right? You do the math. I'm not sure. 10,000, something like that. I don't know. My math is horrible. So let's say it's 10,000. I think I'm right. So you could buy 10,000 people, I think, a $10 lunch. And so 10,000 people get this free lunch. 10,000, yeah, something like that. Get this free lunch. And that's a wonderful thing. They're all happy. But they're all only really happy for a time, for maybe a day, maybe 2. Hey, remember that guy, that goofy guy, he bought us that lunch, and you have made a great number of people happy and so a greater amount of happiness for a greater number of people. But have you really done something that's qualitatively good for those people over a long period of time? No, you haven't. It's not going to last for very long. So how do you weigh, I should take the money and invest it in myself for a lifetime of happiness and goodness, versus I should take these 10,000 people out to lunch and make them happy for a short period of time? Utilitarianism really can't deal with those kinds of scenarios, because the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, quantity, quality, long term, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it's something that it can't really help us to answer. Okay. So that's number 4. Number 5. This is one that I think is probably most important of the weaknesses, and I think it's the one with the longest reaching ramifications, especially for us today, and I think it'll be pretty obvious why. So number 5, fifth weakness for utilitarianism is fairness and minority rights. Again, utilitarianism has a weakness in that, according to its basic premises of the greatest happiness principle, the greatest amount of good for the greatest number, a small percentage of the population could become slaves or even just be mistreated for the greater good of the whole. Now, what that means is that imagine that you've got a small percentage. Let's say you've got the 5% of the population who are, I don't know, we'll just, I don't know what I'm going to call them, Tarks. We'll just call them Tarks. I don't know. Okay. So we've got 5% of the population that's Tarks, right? And it's some, part of humanity, but they're kind of set apart over here on their own. They're Tarks. And so you've got these Tarks who then the rest of us, all the rest of humanity takes, and we enslave them. Wouldn't that bring a greater amount of happiness to the greater number of people? Now, it certainly could, and here's why. Because if you take a small percentage of the population like that, and you cause them to work for no pay, what you're getting is free productivity. Or very, very nearly free productivity. Obviously, you still have to feed them and clothe them and house them, but you've got basically free production, or very, very cheap production. What that means is that you're going to boost the economy of the entire country in that case. And so if we took that small percentage of people, after all, none of us are any of them, none of us are Tarks, and so we bring them in and we enslave them, well, we could then be better off economically, and it would bring a greater amount of happiness and a greater amount of good to a greater number of people. And so what do we do with Tarks? We enslave them, right? And so that's one of the difficulties for Mill and for utilitarianism, is that some smaller part of the population could be abused, and justifiably abused. If utilitarianism is used exclusively, then that might be the right thing to do. It might be a good thing for us to, in this case, enslave Tarks. Now, as I said, I think that this applies very, very specifically to us today, and one more example I think here will kind of help us to see why that is the case. So after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, at the beginning of when World War II, when the United States entered World War II, World War II began in 1939, and the United States came in 1941. And so the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and so because there was no official declaration of war from the Japanese, from the government, from the country of Japan, then it was a kind of, I call it a sneak bombing, right? So they sneak bombed us. We were not at war with these people, and they came in and didn't declare war and then bomb us, but instead they came in and just bombed us, which is very sneaky. It's kind of a underhanded way to begin a war. And the reason they did it is that they were trying to cripple the United States Navy in the Pacific Ocean before that Navy could become active and become a threat to Japan. So it's a preemptive strike. They're coming in, they're trying to wipe out the U.S. Navy, and if they can do that, then effectively the U.S. can't invade the holdings of the Japanese nation, and so it's going to keep us grounded here in the continent of basically North America at that point. And so they were trying to wipe out our Navy there in the Pacific. It didn't turn out that way, obviously, and then eventually the United States gets mobile, and we do in fact invade different parts of the Japanese empire there within the Pacific Ocean. But that was the purpose. Now, because it's kind of sneaky and because it's underhanded, now we know that the Japanese are willing to commit these types of actions in warfare. And so, since we know that, what the United States decided, what they figured would be happening as well, if you're going to do that, if you're going to do that there in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor, then what else would you be trying to do? Well, what I'm going to do, they think, if I'm the Japanese, is I'm going to put a sleeper agent in different places, say on the coast of California, where a lot of the ships, the U.S. Navy ships are being built. I'm going to start slipping in agents who can then, say, sabotage the shipbuilding efforts of the United States there off the west coast of the United States. I'm going to start slipping agents into the manufacturing abilities of the United States there at, say, their Air Force bases. And so they're trying to make planes, and we're going to go in and have our agents sabotage this. So what the United States did, in order to prevent those types of agents to sabotage their ship and airplane building and manufacturing abilities, in order to prevent those types of agents from being able to do that, what do? Well, you round up everyone who is of Japanese descent. Even if they aren't agents, you still round them up. In this case, they took them and they put them up into holding camps, internment camps, in different kind of north and western states, Wyoming, Montana, that type thing. Put them out there in their communities. Now, when they took these individuals out of their home, they took their homes. Obviously, these individuals are going to lose their jobs, and they're put into housing up here in that northern and western states. They move them up into the camps. They're not concentration camps, right? They're internment camps. They're holding camps. But these families are completely uprooted. They are going to lose their economic standing, their economic status, whatever their jobs were. They're going to lose their houses, all of those things. And so the U.S. government pulls them up and puts them into those concentration camps, internment camps, excuse me. Okay, so, and it should be noted, because you certainly don't want to equate the treatment of the Japanese with the treatment of the Jews at the hands of the Nazis. And so, in all seriousness, they were treated better. That doesn't mean what happened to them, what was done to them, was right. It doesn't mean it was right. But I think it would be very, very, I think it would be a moral misstep to equate it and say that it was the same, because the Jews were taken in and killed and tortured in mass, and that's not what the Japanese did. So, in seriousness, the difference between these two activities is quite a bit. It's quite a lot. That doesn't mean that it was right. It just means that it was very different. Okay. So, should the United States have done this? And as I asked this question in my classes, should the United States have pulled the Japanese, out of their homes there, out of California, off the West Coast, and moved them? Should they have done that? The majority of my students at this point are saying no, that's not something that we should have done. And so if you start thinking about it, and I do this because I like to play devil's advocate in these types of situations, think about it for just a moment. If the United States had not done that, and there were sleeper agents there in California, and those individuals, those sleepers, had activated and caused disruption in some of the aircraft carriers that were key in one of the most important battles of the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. Imagine that one of those air carriers had not been able to participate because there was one sleeper agent who somehow sabotaged the aircraft carrier or slowed down the production of that aircraft carrier so that it wasn't ready to go in time to make it to the Battle of Midway. And the Battle of Midway fully and completely, went in another direction, and the Japanese, in fact, did win the Battle of Midway. And then the Japanese began to invade the United States because they would have then had the Navy to have gotten to the U.S.'s west coast. And what prevented that, and I'm not saying it did, but let's say, imagine that is the case, that's what prevented the Japanese from being able to invade the United States, was that the United States behaved in this way and pulled up that percentage, that small percentage of their population that happened to be Japanese, and they moved them up into those holding camps. Would that make it okay? Is that then justifiable? Within the utilitarian system, the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, or the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, the answer would be yes, because a greater number of people in the United States were made to be happy because those Japanese immigrants were pulled up and put over in these holding camps. A greater amount of happiness for the greater number of people. Does that necessarily make it right in this case? Well, the utilitarianist is going to say yes. But what about the lives of those individuals, the lives of those Japanese families, the ones who had done nothing wrong and were as American as the rest of the Americans, who many of those Japanese individuals, not only were they not sleeper agents, many of them wished to serve in the U.S. military to fight against the Japanese government, the Japanese Empire. Many of them wished to go out and fight for their new country, for the United States. What do we do with these types of questions? Now, usually within that, I get some pretty heated debate, and whichever side you fall on is really up to you. But let's try to modernize this particular issue a little bit, because again, here is still that idea of the minority rights. The minority rights could be violated within utilitarianism, because it's the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. These individuals are minorities. So what about, say, for example, when you go into an airport and certain individuals are more often screened than others. Now, I was traveling extensively when 9/11 hit. Like, I was catching 1 and 2 planes a day during that time. And for about a year, I traveled at that level. And I started in June, so I was traveling from June to September prior to 9/11, and then from September to kind of the end of May after 9/11. And so I had about 6 months before and about 6 months after that event, and I was in New York City 3 times after 9/11. And I've got to say, the difference in the airport insecurity was absolutely it was vast. I mean, it was significantly different, very significantly different, and it remains significantly different to this day. But there within the airports, it's supposed to be random screening. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it seems like more often than not, groups of individuals or individuals who are have darker skin and often having a beard will get randomly pulled out of line and searched more often than, say, blonde-haired, blue-eyed females. So a dark-skinned, bearded male seems to get checked more often than the blonde-haired, blue-eyed female. And so what we've got is potentially, or I don't know, but potentially what we've got is a minority of the population who, in a sense, their privacy, one of their rights, is being violated um, because of their appearance. And so you're losing uh, you're you're losing some of your freedom to that privacy. Now, should the FFA, should the airport security, should they engage TSA? Should the airport security engage in this type of profiling in order to try to prevent another 9/11, right? And so here again, I asked this question in class. We've got this minority group of people whose rights are being violated based on appearance, just like the Japanese, right? Just like the Tarks that I made up. Those individuals are having their rights violated in order to bring a greater amount of happiness to a greater number of people. Is that okay? Is that justifiable? Is it acceptable to do those kinds of activities? And again, within my classes, I get all kinds of different answers. I've never really found a majority on this one. The class often splits one way or the other. And if I'm doing this lecture in one class and I turn around and I do it in the next class, in one class, they may say, yes, it should be done. And in the next class, they may say, no, it shouldn't be done. And what we've got here is a country that seems to be quite divided on the issue of exactly how we should manage our airport security because of questions like this. Is it okay to violate the rights of these individuals in order to protect a greater number of people's lives, rights over here on the other side? It's a question that for utilitarianism, it's difficult for them to answer. How exactly do you weigh these two different kinds of issues? Something for you to ponder. I'm not going to tell you the answer, mostly because I don't know that I know the answer. I'm not sure what the answer to this question is. I can see the difficulties on both sides. And what should we do? What should we do? Because we've got two very, very important, valuable pieces here at stake. You've got those rights of the individuals not to be treated or mistreated because of the way they look, because of their appearance. I don't want to live in a country that does that. On the other hand, I do want to live in I want to live in a country where the people's lives are also valued, and if that means that we have to beef up security in order to be sure that we don't have another 9/11 because it was such a horrific act, then certainly we want that kind of security for not just Americans. Hopefully we would want it for all people around the world as well. So you take these two things, which are good. We want to value the rights of our minorities. We also want to value the lives and the rights of other individuals, and we don't want to go through another 9/11. So you've got two good things. Which one weighs the most is the question. And again, the answer, I think, is very complicated, and I think it's very, very difficult. Both matter tremendously, so which way does the scale tilt? Difficult question. And I'm afraid that when we start having these discussions, even in my classroom, often the two sides don't listen to each other. They think that the other side is stupid, the answer is obvious, and the answer isn't obvious. The answer is difficult. It's a difficult answer to come up with. If you truly listen to both sides of the debate, which hopefully you will, and then later what this will do is it will help you listen as well to, say, for example, both sides of the abortion debate. The other side of the abortion debate, from whatever stance you take, they're not stupid, they're not idiots. It's that they're valuing something differently, or they're valuing something more than what it is that you value. And if you'll listen to them very, very carefully, you'll come to understand what it is that they're trying to say. If you can listen through the screaming that often takes place when you have those kinds of debates, if you can hear what they're saying and ignore the volume and the nastiness that both sides tend to push towards each other, if you'll listen closely, you'll see why they're saying what they're saying. And both sides of that debate, just as in both sides of this debate, have something very valuable that they're trying to hold on to, that they're trying to protect. Both things are important. We want both of those things in our society to be protected. And so if you listen closely to a lot of these debates and ignore the rhetoric and ignore the politicians and just hear what's happening, you'll come to see that these are very, very complicated questions, and the answers are equally and sometimes more complicated even than the questions. But you have to listen carefully, and you have to say, you know what, I have my opinion, and your opinion's fine. I have my opinion on this, but I'm willing to hear the other side as well, and truly hear them. Truly hear them. It's a difficult thing to do. Very difficult. Okay, that was weakness number 5. Weakness number 6 is the problem of conflicting rules. And so within utilitarianism, once we have rules that are set up to bring about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, what do we do when the rules conflict? So for example, don't kill is a good basic rule. On the other hand, if you're a soldier on the battlefield and you're trying to protect your homeland against an invading enemy, then you're going to have to kill. And how does utilitarianism handle that? That's a difficulty for them, because now we've got conflicting rules. On something a little closer to home, what if you are your home is invaded, and the individual invading your home is trying to bring harm to you and your family? They are attempting to use lethal force on you and your family. Is it justifiable for you to use lethal force in order to protect yourself and your family? Because after all, don't kill is a good general rule. On the other hand, defending your home and your family is also a good general rule. So how does utilitarianism handle those types of conflicts when rules conflict with themselves? And it's a difficult question for utilitarianism to answer, because which way do you grow the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people? People are going to be affected with the home invasion thing. You know, your family's affected, but the family of the invader is also affected. And what about, how does utilitarianism deal with those types of issues? And it's a difficulty for them. Okay, that is kind of some of the good parts, some of the bad parts. Hopefully you understand a little bit more about utilitarianism, how it functions, how it's helpful. It does give us some very important insights. Utilitarianism says we should think about the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. I think that's very true. I think we need to keep that in mind as we are doing our activities, right? As we're performing, making moral choices, we need to keep in mind that we're not the only ones being affected by what it is that we do, and we should take into account that other people their lives are going to be affected by the choices that we make. Certainly important. On the other hand, is that all that there is to it? Does that ever break down? And we saw that sometimes it does break down with some of the issues, some of the weaknesses that we just looked at. So there's utilitarianism. When we come back next time, we are going to be talking about virtue ethics and the ideas that Aristotle had with regard to morality and how we make decisions, and that will be next time.